So this presentation will give you an overview of the Australian video games market, both from a consumer but also from a developer perspective. Takeaways will include market size, demographics, and trends, and it will also highlight the state of the Australian game development scene and touch on opportunities as well as challenges it faces, and it will give an overview of prominent Australian studios and titles, and such it will set the scene for the later panel on Australian games conquering the world. I've mentioned it before, but it bears repeating. I work for the IGEA, the Interactive Games and Entertainment Association. We're the peak industry association representing the voice of Australian companies in the computer and video games industry. Our members include platform holders, Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo, publishers, EA, Activision, as well as a whole range of game developers, from Australia's largest studios to indies and everything in between. We support the business and public policy interests of the games industry through advocacy, research, and education programs, and as such liaise with a whole bunch of government stakeholders, the media, the wider public, and so on. We're also responsible for GCAP, Games Connect Asia Pacific, Australia's premier game developer conference, as well as the Arcade, which is a co-working space dedicated to video games in Melbourne. So if there's one key takeaway from today's presentation, is that Australians love video games. This is from PwC's Media Outlook 2020. And as you can see here, video games in 2019 accounted for 5.3% of media industry revenue. That means they're behind pay TV as well as free-to-air TV, of course, internet, but I guess that's a human right at this stage. However, if you look at the trajectory of games into 2024, you'll find that they'll have overtaken all the other platforms. They'll be bigger than pay TV, they'll be bigger than free-to-air TV. Of course, they're still smaller than internet, but again, that's to be expected. So there's a really, really impressive trajectory there, and that is also reflected in the demographics. 2 out of 3 Australians play video games. 9 out of 10 households have a device on which games can be played. 78% of players are aged 18 and over, which means the average age is about 34 years. So this is not a hobby for kids or teenagers. This is something that has arrived in the middle of society, and that's also reflected in the gender distribution. 47% of players are female. And 42% of those aged 65 and over do play video games. So they do that to play, or to stay active, to play with their grandkids and so on. But again, testifying to how much games have arrived in the middle of Australian society. And that's also reflected in how much money Australians spent on games. In 2019, it was 3.6 billion. In 2018, it was a bit more than that, 4 billion. So you can see here some of the sectors have lost a little bit. Traditional retail, 928 million. That was down a bit. Digital sales, bigger than traditional retail sales, but still somewhat down by 6%. Look, that's in all likelihood because the console life cycle of the PlayStation 4, the Xbox was coming to an end. And people are looking forward to buying more games. That said, subscription revenue has increased to 273 million in 2019. And you can also see there that mobile revenue makes up a significant chunk of what people spend on games. But we'll look into that into a bit more detail. We also know that in 2020, these numbers will be far exceeded, and that's a surprise to no one. COVID-19 had an impact, of course, also in Australia. So week 11 in 2020, that's March, the lockdown started to be enacted. Physical sales went up 278%. With Doom and Animal Crossing, without it was still 87%, and the hardware sales were correspondingly high. In week 11, sales of games machines jumped by 19%, almost 20%, and then the week after, again by 285%. So in addition to that, the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X and S were released in November 2020, and they were flying off the shelves. So we do expect the number to be significantly higher for 2020, primarily due to COVID, but also a new console life cycle. So you know, Australians are, as it says here, this is again from the PwC Media Outlook, some of the highest per capita spenders in video games in the world. Now, admittedly, that also to an extent has to do with the exchange rate, the cost of games in Australia. However, that's a bit of a short-sighted take on this thing. Australians always spend money on video games and media in general. I mean, this is the country that did the first feature film in the world, and Australians love to spend money on radio back in the day, TV, color TV, cinema. They were always some of the highest per capita spenders in the world. So video games are just a continuation of that pattern here. And yes, you know, exchange rates play a bit of a role, but Australians really, really like playing games, and they spend on them accordingly. So what do they play? Well, there are not really that many surprises there. Console games have traditionally been the cornerstone of the games market in Australia. And you can see here, you know, those are the usual suspects. You have your Call of Duty in there, your GTA 5 even, and, you know, such franchises as Assassin's Creed. So in that sense, fairly aligned with other Western markets. So in terms of mobile then, you know, app-based mobile games have indeed been a significant driver of growth in the market in recent years. So gaming revenue accounted for almost 32% of the total spent in 2019. And that's primarily due to higher smartphone ownership. Well, I mean, the market is almost saturated, but, you know, people are upgrading their phones. So you go from iPhone 10 to 12, and, you know, it's more capable. There are better monetization techniques and so on. That all has contributed to a greatly increased revenue from mobile games, though the rapid expansion has come to an end. But nevertheless, there is still microtransactions that will carry revenue forward, with it being forecast to grow to $1.5 billion in 2024. Australians don't just like to consume games, they also like to make games. This is from our latest dev survey that was released in January this year. There are about 1,245 people working in the games industry, according to the survey. Now, the number in reality is probably a bit higher. This is a survey that we asked developers to fill out, and engagement in 2020 was a bit lower than in 2019, as a result of which that number is bit lower than the reality of the situation, which, you know, if you look at LinkedIn, for example, and how many people say they work in the games industry, you'll find that that is somewhat higher. So it hasn't really moved much according to this compared to the previous survey, the 2019 survey, but we are confident that the number is somewhat higher because revenue is also higher. In 2019, it was 145 million. Now it's almost 185 million. So there is a significant increase there as well. Most of the studios are based in Melbourne, which probably doesn't come as a surprise if you know the Australian game scene. That is followed by Queensland and then New South Wales. However, if you look at where the people are, you'll find, well, again, the majority is in Melbourne, but that's then followed by New South Wales, which has, you know, large studios such as Wargaming, and then Queensland. So they have more studios, but less people working there. So they're a little bit smaller. Employees are highly skilled. Majority of them are programmers, so they're working in a field that is highly transferable in terms of the skills being applicable to other industries. That's something we're very keen on stressing in terms of diversifying the Australian skill set. The majority of people working in the industry are still male, and so we're hoping to see a trend there that other genders get an opportunity to contribute to making games as well, and you know, making interesting games that reflect their experiences as well. 78% of studios are working on their own IP, and 87% of revenue is generated by export. The domestic market is relatively small. There are about 25 million people living in Australia, so Australian devs rely on exporting their games. There's a very international outlook there. There always has been. A lot of the studios are relatively young. Just over half of them are less than 5 years old, which is also testament to the industry's ability to reinvent itself after the global financial crisis. The majority are developing for PC or Mac, followed by mobile and consoles, so sort of roughly commensurate what we see in terms of consumption there as well. Then there is virtual reality and augmented reality. But in terms of the challenges that the industries are facing, the main challenge really is funding. You can see that there points 1 and 2, I mean, can be summarized by means of funding. There is no federal support for video games. There's no tax break similar to Canada or the UK. There is state-based support. So Victoria is a great example of that. There's some really good programs there in terms of attraction funding, prototype funding, marketing support, and so on. But look, other states are doing this as well. South Australia has a 10% tax break for video games. Queensland has a program in place, but you'll hear all about that a little bit later on. The third point here is, in terms of difficulties, is funding talent. Attracting employees with specialized skills, particular senior skills, can be a challenge in a global race, global competition for talent, and a somewhat complicated visa system, an expensive system can make that a bit of a challenge. COVID-19, of course, also a bit of a challenge. Australians currently can't travel, so in terms of the attendance of international events, that limits contacts with investors. Online can replace that to an extent, but still there's no face-to-face interaction. Reduced productivity. Some of our members have been part teacher, part game developer, so that's tough when you're in lockdown, and contractual revenue has reduced for some. However, overall, the picture is fairly positive. 76% of studios expect revenue to remain stable or increase. The same number is not planning on making any redundancies, and 61% look into the future confidently. I mean, who knows what the future will bring, but so far it's been working quite well, in particular compared with other industries. You look at film here in Queensland. Baz Luhrmann shot his Elvis biopic with Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks got COVID, and well, that was it. They had to wrap up. I think it's starting again, but still, pardon me, games are more resilient than film. A lot of our members transitioned to remote work arrangements, including the larger members and the largest members. So that worked relatively well. Here are a couple of examples of games that have made it in Australia, a lot of which you will recognize. There's Untitled Goose Game, the smash hit of 2019 that was made in Melbourne by a team called House. You have Florence with an immediately recognizable art style, which won a whole range of international awards. But Call of Duty, that's partly made in Melbourne, with Sledgehammer Games growing to be one of the biggest, largest studios in Australia. And we have Crossy Road that has been downloaded more than 200 million times, probably 300-400 million times. The 200 million, that's a couple of years ago. You have the indie darling Hollow Knight that was made in South Australia. Real Racing is serviced from Melbourne. Fire Monkeys, Golf Story, one of those hits on the Switch. The Gardens Between, a beautiful game that won an award, Apple Design Award. Fruit Ninja, I mean, that has been downloaded over 1 billion times. And again, a great example of how the industry, the Australian industry, can reinvent itself in view of such challenges as the global financial crisis. Moving Out, great game that won the Australian Game of the Year award at the Australian Game Developer Awards last year. And Australian studios are working on big IPs. So there's Battlestar Galactica. That game is made in Perth. A Mellow, great example of a digital board game. We have World of Tanks, made by Wargaming in Sydney. So they're part of this huge franchise. And we have Mighty Kingdom, which works in such games as Conan Chop and a whole bunch of mobile titles. And they're currently looking at their IPO, so doing pretty well. We have Big End down there with the cricket. They've been sold to a French company for $55 million. There's innovative games like Chorus, which is a crowdfunded musical game. If you've never heard of it, check it out. Or Paperbark down there in the right corner. It is a beautiful game set in Australian landscape. And look, that gives you a bit of an overview of what's out there. We'll explore that further later on the panel. But for now, here's an opportunity for you to ask some questions. So thank you very much.